For if I build again those things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I, through the law, died to the law, that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. This morning I'd like us to reflect on verse 21, Galatians 2 and verse 21. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. It's always good to begin with a recap, and I'm sure none of you would have any objections, none of you who regularly attend Tabernacle would have any objections to me recapping for a moment before we come to this verse. So at the beginning of the year, I said to you all that as Christians, we tend to put ourselves under extra pressure. There's enough pressure in life as there is, and certainly now we're under the most severe pressure. But it seems to me, thinking about all the years that I've been a pastor, that Christians are very good at putting additional pressure on ourselves. Sometimes that additional pressure also comes from other people. And sadly, sometimes pressure is put on us, additional pressure is put on us by preachers and teachers of God's word. So you may remember that I said that there are at least 3 ways in which we are very good at putting additional pressure on ourselves. The first is we put pressure on ourselves to be better than we are. We think that we ought to be less sinful than we are, and that's probably fair enough. That we should perhaps do better than we do. We should live at a higher level than we live. So we have this constant sense that we are not good enough, that we ought to be better. The second way in which we then put pressure on ourselves is we think we ought to be more trusting than we are. That when we are going through a tough time, that we ought to be men and women who have faith. And we, in fact, take those 2 words, have faith, and we use them to pressurize ourselves in the various circumstances of life. And others will tell us when we're having a hard time and we are sharing our difficulties with them, others will sometimes say to us, well, have faith, as if that's the answer then to the difficulties we are facing. So we have pressure there. And then the third way, it seems to me, that we put additional pressure on ourselves is in our witness as Christians to those who are not Christians. We feel that we ought to be different, that we ought to show difference to those around us who are not Christians. So that if we're having a conversation with somebody who's not a Christian, we feel the pressure to show that person that somehow or other we are different. Sometimes that means we try to show people that we are better, that we are less anxious or more trusting in God or whatever it is. But there's the pressure. So the first pressure is in relation to sin. We should be better than we are. The second pressure is in relation to faith. We ought to be more trusting than we are. And then the third pressure is in relation to what we sometimes call evangelism. We ought to be better, more different to others. Now, those pressures are unique, I think, to Christian people, and they make life tough. Life's tough enough as it is, but for whatever reason, we are experts at creating these additional pressures. And often when we go to church, we are told to be better, more trusting, more different, and our sense of pressure increases, and we come out of church more burdened than when we went in. My aim is to try and alleviate that pressure so that we just cope with the ordinary pressures of life. They're enough, especially now. with the coronavirus and all that it's bringing. Why do we need extra pressure? So to do that, to try and alleviate these pressures, I've said to you that what we need is a very good understanding of our Christian identity and our relationship with Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we are deriving both of those from Galatians chapter 2, verses 18 through to 21. I've pointed out to you that the pronoun I occurs 8 times in these verses. So we're going to take that I and we're going to build a sense of identity, Christian identity from that. So if you look again at the verses, I build again, I make myself, I through the law, I might live to God, I have been crucified with Christ, it is no longer I who live. So I is being emphasized by Paul, the I of identity. If we have a very strong understanding of who we are as Christians, we will be strong enough to withstand those pressures from when they come from ourselves and from when they come from other people. So I. Then you have the word me, and that occurs 3 times in these verses. Christ lives in me. Christ gave himself for me and loved me. So, of course, we need a very good understanding of the nature of our relationship with the Son of God, Jesus Christ. And that relationship, your relationship with Christ, is founded on who he is, what's true of him, and what he has done for you. His love for you is where our relationship begins. This is love, not that we loved him, but that he loved us. So it's his love for us, this unique personal love for us, that is our starting point. And that love expresses itself in the way Christ gave himself for us. So our relationship with him. Okay, so in terms of Christian identity then, we've said that the one way in which we can understand our identity as Christians is to think that we have 3 lives. Now, this is not exactly a very refined way of thinking about it, but I think it's helpful. So let's remind ourselves that to be a Christian means you've had 3 lives. You've had a past life. That's the first life that we've had. So take those statements in those verses that refer to the past. I have been crucified with Christ. I died to the law. It is no longer I who live. So every Christian has this past life in which the I stood alone before God. The I stood in its own merits, by its own works, unshielded before God. That I was dead in its trespasses and sins. That I was under the judgment of God. That I was under the wrath of God. That I was without God, without Christ, without hope. So that I, me alone, standing naked on my own merits before God, that I has gone. That I was crucified with Christ. So all that I was, and in many ways that I remains, that I has died. So the Neil, the you, that old I, God has dealt with. God has settled. The account has been settled on the cross in Christ. All that God demanded of that I, because God had made me that I, that has been settled. It's dealt with, it's done, it's over, it's gone. That I is dead. That's the past life. Then we have a future life. So just check out in chapter 5 and verse 5, Paul makes a very quick reference to this future life in this verse. So Galatians 5 and verse 5. For we, through the Spirit, eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. This is a particular formulation that Paul is using right now to refer to the future life of glory. It's a life where we will be made righteous, and we wait for it by faith, and the Spirit of God enables us to wait for that future life by faith. That's our glory. That's the revelation of the sons of God. Creation itself is waiting for that moment. We are sustained by the hope of that future. That's our future life. And as you come back to Galatians 2, and especially verse 20, do you remember that what we have in between the past life and the future life is the now life? So Galatians 2, verse 20. The life which I live now. So you and I, as Christian people, we are in the now life. And that now life is marked by that awful word that I always find difficult to say. It's marked by flesh. So you can see it in Galatians 2, verse 20. The life which I now live in the flesh. So we live in the flesh. We live the now life, and it's a life characterized by weakness, struggle, battle. It's a life that's characterized by defeat and failure and mistakes. This is the now life that we are living. So imagine what we do then when we bring those precious to bear on living a now life, which is lived in the flesh. So here I am, a Christian. My now life is marked by the flesh. And then I tell myself I've got to be better. And I tell myself I've got to be more faithful and trusting, and I've got to be different. The now life is marked by flesh. And one of the most wonderful things to remember is that when God sent his Son into our world, God sent him in the likeness of sinful flesh. Romans 8, verse 3. The perfect Son of God became man, and his humanity was marked by living life in the flesh. Jesus didn't live amongst us as some Superman, untouched with our struggles, or as the writer puts it, the feeling of our infirmities. Jesus came and lived a life in the flesh, like we are. So however much we would want it to be otherwise, and however much over the years Christians have made out that it can be otherwise, the harsh reality is we are living a life in the flesh. And yes, we're indwelt by the Spirit of God who makes intercession for us. We have new life, of course we do. The resurrection power of God has raised us from the dead and brought us into this now life, but it remains a life characterized by the flesh. But what Paul says then in that same phrase in Galatians 2 verse 20 is we live this now life in the flesh by faith in the Son of God. And what he means there is we live it by the reality of the Son of God, by the reality of who he is, what he has done. We live this life in the flesh on the foundation of the achievements of the person of the Son of God, his eternal life, his life in the flesh like us, his death on the cross, his resurrection from the dead, at the right hand of God praying for us. That's the foundation that we build our now life in the flesh upon. And that's what Paul is encouraging us to do here. That's our identity then. Okay, so that's a resume of what we've done so far. If you turn to verse 21 now, can you see that verse 21 quite nicely falls into three? You've got, I do not set aside the grace of God. That's our first phrase. The second phrase is, for if righteousness comes through the law. And then the final phrase, Christ died in vain. So let's allow the verse to fall into those three parts. And I'm going to take them in this order. I want us to first of all think about the phrase, for if righteousness comes through the law. Then we'll talk about the third of those phrases, Christ died in vain. And then we'll finish this morning then with that wonderful statement, the final I statement. I do not set aside the grace of God. Okay, that's our plan. So look at the middle statement. For if righteousness comes through the law. The great struggle, I think, of the Christian life, the great struggle in the now life, is to not fall back into the idea that righteousness comes through the law. This is a constant struggle, and I fall back into it myself, and I know many of you, some more than others perhaps, fall back into this old idea that rightness with God comes through the law. This phrase refers to the old life. It refers to the I that is now dead. That I that stood alone before God. That I, if that I could have kept the law, then that I, that old you, would have been right with God. Through our own efforts, through our own works, our own virtues, our own goodness, our own promises to God, if we could have done so by keeping the law, we would have been right with God. But we could not. So what to me seems to happen is this. Our old life has left a deep impression on us, even in our Christian lives. And when we face pressures, that old life raises itself again. The old voice that belongs to the old life seeks to be heard again. So that when the pressures are there, that voice from the old life starts to say, come on, you need to be better than this. Come on, you need to trust more than you're doing. Come on now, Neil, you're talking to a non-Christian here. You need to be better. And that old voice is heard at those moments of pressure, at those moments of failure and weakness, at those moments when the flesh of the now life has got the upper hand. That's when the old voice is heard by us again. And so look at that phrase again. For if righteousness comes through the law, all of us need to guard against it. We need to resist this idea. And we especially need to resist the idea when other people start to tell us we need to be better than we are, that we shouldn't do the things we do. We shouldn't go, not that we can now, to certain places. We need to resist that because that is the old idea, righteousness through law. So can you take a moment? I think you're all listening rather well, as far as I can tell. Take a moment to reflect on how often, when you have done something you consider to be wrong, you've made a mistake, you have an instant voice that tells you, right, Neil, you're in trouble now. You're in trouble in your relationship with God, and you've got to try harder. That's what Paul is warning us against. And the more you get to know yourselves as Christian people, the more you get to know your own heart, the more you'll know just how difficult this is, to not fall back into that old self-righteous idea. is so powerful, so deep-rooted, so resistant to learning the lessons of grace, that we need to be constantly on our guard, not to fall back. And it seems to me we can fall back by feeling pleased with ourselves if we have managed to do something that we think is good. So it's the idea that God can only carry on blessing me, only carry on loving me, only carry on hearing my praise and answering me if I, see the I there? If I. Christian identity understands very clearly that I, upon which you feel everything depends for your ongoing relationship with God and God's ongoing loving of you and blessing of you, that I is dead. And we have a job to kill him or keep him dead rather, as we go through our Christian lives. And when the pressure's on, this old I wants to be raised from the dead and wants to do his worst. So I'm going to encourage you. Don't let yourself slip back into the idea that righteousness, your ongoing rightness with God, is a matter of you and your works. Because if that's your view, and if that's what you fall back into, then we need to look at the third phrase in verse 21. Christ died in vain. If you put any trust at all in who you are and your goodness and your efforts, if you put any store, put any merit at all in you at any level and at any point during the day, then Christ has died in vain. The death of Christ covers everything. It covers every moment of every day of the whole of your life. It covers every sin and every failure and every struggle and every weakness, every failure. It's all covered by the death of Christ. When he made himself an offering for sin, or if you like, go back to verse 20. When he gave himself for you, he gave himself completely for you. He gave himself without any reservations for you. He gave himself without any conditions for you. He gave himself without any exceptions for you. He knows you. He knows your struggles, your weaknesses, your triumphs. He knows where life is really hard for you. He knows those things that shame you and embarrass you and the things you'd never ever mention to anyone else. He knows those things about you. He's always known. He has loved you and he has known those things, and he gave himself for those things so that you might be free, that you might be free of the guilt, free of the shame, free of the anxiety. He has taken it all upon himself. From the moment of your first to last breath, every aspect of our sinful experience, he has taken it all upon himself and freely and wonderfully paid the price for you on that cross and borne the wrath of God, cried out to God, why have you forsaken me? All has been done on the cross. It's absolutely vital, isn't it, that we see the stark horror of what we are doing when we put any trust in ourselves, when we have the slightest whiff of self-righteousness. We are saying, in effect, Christ has died in vain. And we would be horrified at that very suggestion. So we must guard against the slipping back into any form of self-trust, self-reliance, offering anything to God of our own obedience in order to merit his favors in some way or another. It means when we do that we are really saying Christ died in vain. And that's just a horror. So guard against these slippages into self-righteousness. Rather, we need to remember how verse 21 opens. I do not set aside the grace of God. What's your identity as a Christian? To be a Christian means we are people of grace. There is grace available to us. There is grace there for us every moment, every day, for every burden, every trial, every sin, every weakness, every struggle. There is grace which is abundant. There is grace which is sufficient. There is grace which is unlimited in the person of Jesus Christ. And so to be a Christian means, and I've tried really hard to think of a different word here, but my imagination has failed me, so sorry about that. Our identity as a Christian means we are to avail ourselves. Isn't it a terrible word? It means to get, just simply get the grace that is there for you, no matter what the reason for it. Whatever the reason, doesn't matter what the reason is. If it's a sinful reason, if it's a burdensome reason, it does not matter. If there's a reason, then there's grace. If there is a struggle, then there's grace. And we've learned over many years, haven't we, everyone, that the grace of God is described by the Apostle Peter as multicolored. We all know it. I think for many of us, this understanding of grace is very deeply rooted. Grace is multicolored, like Joseph's coat. Similarly, we are told by James that trials are multicolored. James 1 verse 2, I think. So we have in the person of Jesus Christ all the grace that we ever need for every day and in every situation. And what we need to do is to avail ourselves. So if you, for example, sin, if you fail, it's not a case of that instant old voice being heard again, whereby we then make a promise to God to be better. When we fail, when we sin, what we need to learn is in that moment turn to God. Not with shame, not with guilt, but in that moment turn to God and say, God, right now, I need that grace that is sufficient, abundant, that grace which is available in Jesus Christ. If you're fearful, if we don't know what the future holds for us, we say to our God, grant me that grace that is more than available to me to meet my needs in the here and now, in this now life that I'm living in the flesh. So to end, and thank you for listening so far, the end then is back to Hebrews and chapter 4 and that verse 16. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The time of need there is when we're at our worst. And really that's what the preacher should have said. When you feel you're at your worst, that's not the time to try harder. When you're at your worst, it's not the time to hide. It's not the time to hide from God until you feel better. when you're at your worst, is when you come to God and you come to his throne and you ask for that help and that grace, because that's your time of need. We love to put on a face, don't we? We love to look good. And we spend a lot of time and effort looking good in front of each other. And I've got my smart Sunday suit on, so I'm looking good. Well, whatever. But we do try to look good, don't we? And it's not about looking good. It's about, at those worst moments, coming to God, not in fear, because there's nothing to be afraid of. It is the God of all grace. It is the God of mercy, the God of compassion. It's to come to him and to find in him all the grace that we stand in need of. So this is our Christian identity. The old is gone. The future is yet to come. We are now living the now life, and it's a life in the flesh. Okay? Very, very important to remember that. We used to hear words about victory, didn't we? And we used to hear words about overcoming, and we used to have the whole holiness movement that promised us to float above all our problems. And of course, there was the old heresy in Colossians, the Gnostic heresy, where those false preachers were claiming you could have more power and you could have more victory and you could live at a higher plane. And then Paul the apostle would say, no, it's a life in the flesh. But we've been raised from the dead and all our sins have been dealt with. And we have a great high priest who is tested like us and who prays for us. And we have the Spirit of God who indwells us and prays for us. And we have his word, and we have all the resources of heaven, and we have all the grace that we need, and we have one another to strengthen each other in fellowship and in faith. So let's get this really solid sense of Christian identity. And there's a challenge now for us, guys. If the first set of pressures to do with sin and the need to be better, the second set of pressures are to do with faith. And we need to start thinking about, what is faith then? And what does it mean to have faith and to trust? Now, this is going to be a big challenge to try and make any sense at all about faith. And especially when other Christians tell you in the midst of all your difficulties, oh, have faith. We need to really understand how to answer that and how to live by faith. So that's our direction of travel. We'll have our work cut out, and we'll need God to help us.